I wasn't even supposed to be there that day. My flight back to Edinburgh had been delayed, some technical issue with the aircraft, the kind of vague announcement that tells you nothing but wastes your whole afternoon. So I did what anyone does when they're stranded in London with 3 hours to kill. I grabbed a coffee from a cart near St. James's Park, pulled my scarf tighter because October in London doesn't ask permission before it gets cold, and I started walking. I ended up near the mall. Then, almost without deciding to, I found myself drifting toward Buckingham Palace. Now, I've been to the palace before. Twice, actually. Once as a kid with my parents, once in my 20s on a work trip when a colleague insisted we do the tourist thing properly. Both times I stood behind the railing, looked at the guards, took a few photos, and moved on. The way most people do. You admire the spectacle of it, the uniforms, the stillness, the whole performance of British pomp, and then you go find a pub. But that Tuesday afternoon in October was different. I don't know how to explain it except to say that the air felt different. That sounds like something a novelist writes when they want to seem deep, but I mean it practically. The crowd was thinner than usual. The sky had gone the color of old pewter, that flat gray that makes everything feel quieter somehow. There was a light drizzle, the kind that doesn't quite commit to being rain but still manages to make your hair damp. Most tourists had retreated under umbrellas or gone inside somewhere warm. I stayed. I found a spot near the front of the small crowd that remained, maybe 15 or 20 people, a mix of visitors with cameras around their necks and a few Londoners who'd stopped briefly on their way to somewhere else. There were 2 guards visible from where I stood. The one on the left, stationed in the sentry box closer to the main gate, was completely motionless. I mean completely. Like a man who had turned himself into architecture. His face was blank. His eyes fixed on nothing in particular. His bearskin hat sitting perfectly level. The other guard, stationed a few meters to the right, was similar. Still. Controlled. Professional. That's the thing people don't quite understand until they've stood there for a while and actually watched. These men aren't statues. They're breathing, thinking, living people who have trained themselves, sometimes for years, to perform stillness as an act of duty. It's more impressive than it looks. I've seen tourists try to make them flinch. Grown adults, embarrassing themselves, pulling faces inches from these men's noses. The guards don't blink. They just endure it. I'd been standing there for maybe 20 minutes, sipping the last of my coffee, half watching the guards and half watching a Japanese family try to get the perfect photograph, when I noticed the car. It came from the direction of the palace itself, which meant it came from inside the gates, not from the street. A dark vehicle, I couldn't tell you the make, something long and quietly expensive looking, the kind of car that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. It moved slowly along the inner road and then stopped just inside the gate. Not parked properly. Just stopped. A door opened. And a girl stepped out. Now, I want to be careful here, because I know how these things sound when you write them down. I know how people on the internet react to stories involving royals. I'm not the type who obsesses over the royal family. I don't follow their social media accounts or buy the magazines with their faces on the cover. So I want to be honest with you, I didn't know immediately who she was. It was only later, after everything that happened, after I'd walked back to the station in something of a daze and pulled up the news on my phone, that I understood who I'd been watching. But, standing there in that drizzle, what I saw was a girl. She looked young. Not tiny, not the age where you'd think small child, but young in the way that's somewhere between girlhood and the beginning of something else. She was wearing a coat, dark navy, neatly fitted, the collar turned up slightly against the wind. Her hair was pulled back but the drizzle had loosened pieces of it around her face. She had good posture, the kind that's been trained into you, not the kind that comes naturally, but in that moment her shoulders were doing something her posture couldn't quite hide. They were tight. Pulled inward. The way shoulders get when a person is trying to hold themselves together from the outside because something on the inside is threatening to come apart. She stood beside the car for a moment. Just a moment. Then, she glanced back through the car window, at someone inside, I assumed, and whatever she saw there, or didn't see there, made her take one small step away from the vehicle. Just one step. But it was the kind of step that means something. I've seen enough of life, enough difficult things, enough quiet human moments to know when a person is trying to make a decision they're not sure they're allowed to make. She was standing in that particular space between staying and going, between following the rules of wherever she'd come from and doing something her gut was telling her to do. And then she looked at the guard. Not at the crowd. Not at the tourists or the cameras or the grey London sky. She looked directly at the guard closest to the gate, the one on the right, the one I'd been watching, and the look on her face was not the look of a princess. It was the look of someone who needed help. His name, I found out much later, was Corporal James Whitfield. He'd been stationed at Buckingham Palace for just over 2 years at that point. Before that, he'd done a tour overseas, I won't say where because I don't know the details well enough to say anything accurate, and, before that, he'd trained at Catterick. He was 31 years old. Average height. Broad through the shoulders in the way that comes from genuine physical work, not the gym. His face, under the bearskin, was the kind of face that doesn't give much away, square-jawed, steady eyes, the particular blankness of a man who's practiced it. I didn't know any of this while I was watching him. What I noticed, standing there in the damp, was that he blinked. That sounds like nothing. But, you have to understand, these guards don't react. Not to tourists, not to noise, not to weather. They are trained specifically and, exhaustively not to react. So when Corporal Whitfield, this statue of a man in his immaculate uniform, blinked twice and, then, almost imperceptibly, shifted his eyes toward the girl by the car, it was like watching a sculpture suddenly breathe. Something passed between them in that glance. I don't know what. I couldn't read it clearly from where I was standing. But, I know what I felt watching it, I felt the atmosphere change. The way it does before weather. Or before an argument in a quiet room. That electric, invisible shift. The girl's chin moved just slightly. A tiny dip. Not quite a nod. More like acknowledgement. More like, you see me. And, he did. The question was what he would do about it. A guard at Buckingham Palace does not leave his post. This is not a minor rule or a suggestion. It is the foundation of the entire ceremonial duty. Leaving your post uninstructed, without authorization, during a guard shift is not just against protocol, it is a serious military matter. There are procedures for everything. If something happens, you signal. You alert. You follow the chain of command. You do not, under any circumstance, simply step out of your box and walk toward someone. Corporal Whitfield knew this better than I did. He knew it the way you know things that have been repeated to you so many times they become part of your breathing. He had followed this protocol for 2 years. He had stood motionless while tourists shouted in his face. He had maintained his position during rain and cold and the particular indignity of being treated like a prop in someone else's holiday memory. He stood there now, rigid as ever, eyes forward again. And, for a moment, maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute, nothing happened. The girl stood beside the car. The drizzle continued. The Japanese family finished their photographs and moved away. A pigeon landed near the fence and then left again, apparently unimpressed. And then, and I want to be precise about this because it's the kind of moment that seems impossible until you've actually witnessed it, Corporal James Whitfield took one step forward. Just one. Out of the sentry box. Out of his designated position. Out of the 2 years of ingrained protocol. One step. And, in that one step, somehow, everything changed. You have to understand the silence that followed that one step. Not real silence, there was still the distant sound of traffic along the mall, still the murmur of the remaining tourists, still the drizzle making its soft irrelevant noise against the pavement. But, a particular kind of silence fell over the people standing near me. The way a crowd goes quiet when something unexpected happens and nobody yet knows whether it's wonderful or terrible. A woman to my left, 50s, sensible walking shoes, a red umbrella she'd been turning absently in her hands, stopped turning it. A man with a camera let it drop to chest level without taking the shot. I stopped thinking about my delayed flight. Whitfield, though I didn't know his name then, had stepped out of the sentry box. He held his position for a moment, standing at the edge of what I can only describe as his jurisdiction. His head didn't turn dramatically. He didn't reach for anything or shout anything or gesture wildly. He simply moved into a position where he could be seen more clearly by the girl beside the car. It was deliberate. Every part of it was deliberate. He was making himself available without abandoning his duty entirely. Finding the exact millimeter of space between protocol and humanity. And, watching him do it, watching someone navigate that kind of impossible narrow line in real time, was one of the most quietly remarkable things I've ever seen. The girl saw it. She exhaled, I could see it from where I stood, the slight drop of her shoulders, the small release of breath that people do when they've been holding on tight and, suddenly, something gives them permission to let go just a fraction. Not all the way. Just enough. She took 2 steps toward the gate. Now, I need to explain the geography here because it matters. The gates at Buckingham Palace are not like a door you walk through. There are multiple layers of security, personnel, barriers. You don't simply approach the gate and speak to a guard on ceremonial duty. That's not how it works. The guards performing the ceremonial function, the ones the tourists photograph, are not the same as the operational security. They have a specific role and specific boundaries. Which is why what happened next was so extraordinary. The girl stopped at the inner edge of the gate, still on palace grounds, still technically inside, and she said something. I couldn't hear it. I was standing maybe 12 meters away, on the public side of the railing, with the gate structure between us. Whatever she said it quietly. Not a whisper exactly, but the voice of someone who is used to being careful about who hears what they say. Whitfield heard it. His face changed. Not dramatically. Not the way faces change in films, where every emotion telegraphs itself in sweeping, obvious ways. It was subtle. A slight tightening around the eyes. A shift in his jaw. The look of a man receiving information that requires him to make an instant calculation he wasn't expecting to make. He responded. I still couldn't hear what he said. But I watched his lips move, watched his posture adjust, still straight, still professional, but angled now toward her in a way that communicated attention rather than ceremonial blankness. She spoke again. And, this time, the second time, something happened to her face that I have thought about many times since. Because it was one of those unguarded human moments that you don't expect to witness in public, especially not from someone who has been trained since childhood to manage every public expression. Her eyes filled. Not spilling over. Not crying in the way that's obvious and messy. But that precursor to it, that bright, sudden, involuntary shine that comes into a person's eyes when something has built up behind them for too long and the tiniest kindness from a stranger becomes the thing that nearly breaks the dam. She wasn't falling apart. She was just, for one unguarded second, a young person who was frightened and tired and needed something to be different, and had finally found someone who seemed willing to see that. I found out later, piecing things together from several sources, none of them official, all of them second or third hand, the way you do with these things, that the afternoon had been a difficult one. There had been an event. A formal something, luncheon or briefing or meeting, the specific details weren't ones I could confirm, that had run longer than expected and had not gone smoothly. Not a public-facing event. Something internal. Something within the palace environment itself, the kind of situation that never makes the papers because it's not meant to, because the institutional machinery that surrounds the royal family is extraordinarily good at keeping the quiet difficulties quiet. Charlotte, Princess Charlotte, who I now understand, watching, had been part of this afternoon in some capacity. She was young, still navigating what it means to have public duty as a permanent condition of your existence, still learning how to carry the weight of a role that she didn't choose, that she was born into, that will follow her for the rest of her life whether she wants it to or not. I don't know exactly what had happened. I don't think it matters, really, in the way that specifics often don't matter when what you're actually talking about is a feeling. What I could see, what was plainly visible, even to a stranger standing in the drizzle on the public side of a palace gate, was that she had reached some kind of limit. Not a dramatic limit. Not a breakdown. Just that quiet, private, deeply human moment where everything that's been fine and managed and held together simply becomes for one afternoon, a bit too heavy. And, the car, whatever it represented, whoever was inside it, had not been the solution. So she'd stepped away from it. And, she'd looked at the guard. Now here is the part that still makes me slow down when I think about it. Because what Corporal Whitfield did next, what he actually did, the full sequence of it, was not what I expected. And, I think it wasn't what anyone around me expected either. He didn't call for backup immediately. He didn't raise his hand or signal to the other guard or step back into his box. He didn't do the procedurally correct thing, which would have been to remain in position and let the proper channels handle whatever was unfolding. What he did was speak to her. Not briefly. Not just long enough to say, "I'll alert the proper personnel, please remain calm." He actually spoke to her quietly, steadily, the way you'd speak to someone who needed to feel that the ground wasn't going to shift under them. I watched his face while he did it. Watched the deliberate, unhurried quality of it. Watched him give her his full attention as though there were no crowd, no cameras, no protocol in the world. The woman with the red umbrella beside me made a small sound. I glanced at her. She was watching the scene with her hand pressed lightly to her mouth, the way people do when they see something unexpectedly tender. "Is that?" she started. "I think so," I said. Though I wasn't sure yet. "Oh," she said quietly. And, then, "Good for him." Just that. Good for him. As if she'd immediately understood the weight of what she was watching and had made her decision about it in an instant. The man with the camera, I noticed, did not raise it again. None of us did, the small damp cluster of strangers who'd stayed to watch. Nobody was filming this. Nobody reached for their phone. I've thought about that since, too. Why? Whether it was decency or discomfort or just the particular paralysis of witnessing something genuinely human in a world where everything has become content. Maybe it was just that some moments asked to be left alone. The conversation between the guard and the girl lasted, I think, about 4 minutes. Maybe 5. Time felt strange. At some point a second figure appeared from further within the palace grounds, walking quickly, the walk of someone who's been informed that something requires their attention. An official of some kind, older, wearing the kind of dark suit that lives in formal environments. He stopped when he reached Charlotte, spoke briefly, listened. She nodded. Once. A small, composed nod. And, then, she looked back at Whitfield. What passed between them in that final glance, I couldn't name it exactly. Gratitude, yes. But, something more layered than simple gratitude. Something that acknowledged the strangeness of it. A young royal girl and a ceremonial guard, standing at the edge of their respective worlds for 5 minutes in the drizzle, finding a piece of genuine human connection in the most unlikely of architectures. He gave a small, almost invisible nod in return. Then, he stepped back into the sentry box. Clicked back into position. And, became a statue again. The crowd around me exhaled slowly. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then, the Japanese family, who had returned from somewhere and had, apparently, caught the last of it, started talking quietly amongst themselves, and the ordinary sounds of the afternoon flooded back in, and people began to drift away or reposition their cameras, and the world resumed being itself. I stood there for another few minutes. I didn't fully understand what I'd seen. Not the specifics. Not the why or the what led to it. But, I understood the shape of it, the emotional architecture. A girl at a difficult point, alone in a way that wealth and position cannot fix. A man whose entire professional duty consists of making himself unreachable, choosing, for 5 minutes, to be reachable instead. And, the astonishing, fragile, ordinary thing that resulted. Help. Just help. The simplest thing. Given across the strangest possible distance. The official in the dark suit had guided Charlotte back toward the palace entrance. The car was still there, still stopped in that slightly incongruous way, but its door was now closed and, whatever it represented had become, for the moment, irrelevant. She didn't look back at the crowd. But, just before she turned fully away, she paused. One hand came up briefly, barely, and touched the collar of her coat. A small, private gesture. The kind of thing a person does when they're settling themselves. Reminding themselves, you're all right. You're all right. You can keep going. Then, she walked back inside. And, I thought, standing there in the October drizzle, that girl is going to be fine. Not today. Maybe not this week. But, eventually. She is going to be absolutely fine. I walked back to the station slowly. That's the best way I can describe the state I was in, walking slowly in a city that never walks slowly, which should tell you something about how much that afternoon had taken me somewhere unexpected. My coffee was long gone. The drizzle had upgraded itself at last into actual rain, proper rain, the committed kind, and I hadn't brought an umbrella because I never bring an umbrella, which is one of my most consistent character flaws. My jacket was damp through the shoulders. The delay to my flight would probably extend further. None of that felt important. I passed a woman selling flowers near the entrance to St. James's Tube. Roses, mostly, and some chrysanthemums in that pale yellow color that always looks slightly apologetic. I stopped and bought a small bunch, not for any particular reason, not for anyone specific. Sometimes you just need to carry something bright when the world has gone gray. I stood on the platform at Victoria waiting for my train and I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. The thing is, and I think this is the heart of it, the part one kept circling back to in the days that followed, the thing is that what Corporal Whitfield did was technically wrong. Let me be clear about that, because I don't want to dress it up into something uncomplicated. He left his post. He deviated from protocol. He crossed a line that exists for reasons that aren't arbitrary. Ceremonial guard duty at the palace is not decorative. It's tied to security, to chain of command, to 100 considerations that I, standing in the rain as a civilian, could not fully understand. The rules that govern these men are there because without them, the structure doesn't hold. He broke the rules. And the reason he broke them was because he could see a young person who was frightened, and the rule in that moment was preventing him from being a human being. I've thought about that a lot. The ethics of it. The quiet impossibility of it. What it actually costs to make that choice, to step outside the container of duty, even briefly, even carefully, even with every intention of stepping back inside. What it costs in terms of the professional risk. What it costs in terms of the internal wrestling that must precede it, that millisecond where you decide whether the person in front of you matters more than the regulation. He decided she did. I think about that, and I think that is what integrity looks like in its most unglamorous form. Not the integrity of following rules when it's easy. The integrity of understanding, in your bones, what the rules are actually for and choosing, when they stop serving that purpose, to serve the purpose directly. There's something I haven't told you yet. About halfway through the exchange I described, while Whitfield was speaking to Charlotte, while the crowd around me had gone quiet and the woman with the red umbrella had her hand to her mouth, I noticed the other guard. The one in the sentry box on the left. The one who had been perfectly, rigidly motionless for as long as I'd been watching. He was still motionless. Still fixed. Still performing his duty with complete precision. But his eyes had shifted, almost infinitesimally, toward his colleague. And what I read in those eyes, which I admit might be entirely my own projection, the product of a storytelling mind finding meaning in incidental detail, what I read was not disapproval. It was not the guarded alarm of a professional watching a colleague commit an error. It was something closer to recognition. Like he understood exactly what was happening. Like he'd perhaps been in his own version of that impossible moment at some point in his career. Like he was watching a man do something he might have done himself. He looked forward again immediately. Resumed his blankness. Never moved. But, that shift, those 2 seconds of sideways glance, felt like its own kind of solidarity. The unspoken kind. The kind that doesn't require words because words would ruin it. 2 men, stationed meters apart in their identical red tunics, playing out 2 different versions of the same duty. One holding the form of it. One holding the meaning of it. Both of them, in their own way, getting it right. I looked up Corporal Whitfield about a week later. I want to be honest, I'm not sure if I found the right person. The name came to me through a circuitous route, a friend of a friend who worked in a peripheral way around palace circles, who mentioned it casually in the way people sometimes share information without quite realizing they're sharing something significant. It's possible the name is wrong. It's possible I've constructed a clearer picture of him than reality warrants. What I found, assuming I found the right man, was not very much. A few mentions in the context of ceremonial duties. A photograph from a parade, face partially obscured by the bearskin as always. No social media presence, which makes sense. These men tend to exist, publicly, as symbols rather than people. But I found one thing. A brief mention in a regimental newsletter, the kind of in-house document that circulates internally and, occasionally surfaces online, from about 8 months before that afternoon. An entry noting that Corporal J. Whitfield had received a commendation for conduct reflecting exceptional judgment and presence of mind during an unspecified incident involving a visiting member of the public who had become distressed on palace grounds. Exceptional judgment and presence of mind. That was all it said. I sat with that for a while. The bureaucratic understatement of it. The way it sanitized into official language something that had presumably been, in the moment, viscerally human. Someone distressed. A guard making a choice. Judgment. Presence of mind. I thought about the word exceptional. Because here's the thing, here's what I keep coming back to, weeks and months after standing in that drizzle watching it happen, it shouldn't be exceptional. The ability to see another person's distress and respond to it, human to human, across every barrier of protocol and rank and circumstance, that shouldn't be exceptional. It should be ordinary. It should be the baseline. It should be the thing we assume about people until they prove otherwise. But it isn't ordinary. Not in practice. Not in the world as it actually runs, with its hierarchies and its chains of command and its very good reasons for why you follow the procedure and not your gut. The procedure exists because guts are unreliable. Because sentiment can be manipulated. Because the moment you start making individual judgment calls in systems that require consistency, the whole machinery wobbles. I understand this. I really do. And, yet. Whitfield wobbled the machinery for 5 minutes in October, on a drizzly afternoon, in front of 15 damp tourists and one woman with a red umbrella, and what resulted was not catastrophe. What resulted was a young girl who was frightened becoming, fractionally, less frightened. What resulted was a small act of dignity, given freely, at personal professional risk, to someone who needed it. What resulted was the thing that good systems are supposedly built to produce, achieved by briefly stepping outside the system. The irony of that is almost too neat to be real life. But it was real life. I was there. The question I've been asked most often, when I've told this story to people privately, is, did Charlotte know he'd taken a risk? Did she understand, in the moment or afterward, that the man who spoke to her had done something that could have consequences for him? That the protocol he'd bent was not bent lightly? I don't know. I genuinely don't. I'd like to think she did. I'd like to think that some part of her training, or simply some part of her human instinct, registered the significance of what he'd offered. That the help he gave her carried additional weight precisely because it cost him something to give it. But she might not have known. She might have simply experienced it as, a person saw that I needed help and they helped me. Which is, on its own, already a remarkable thing to have experienced, to have been truly seen by a stranger in a moment of genuine need. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's actually the whole story. There's a version of this that becomes very grand and significant. A future queen, in a moment of private distress, protected not by institution but by individual conscience. A guard who chose humanity over hierarchy. The palace, the protocol, the people, all capital letters and sweeping conclusions about the nature of duty and the soul of monarchy. I'm not writing that version. I'm writing the version where a young girl was having a hard afternoon and a man with a good heart and a very tall hat decided, for 5 minutes, to actually do his job, not the ceremonial version of it, but the real version. The one that's always been underneath the uniform. Protect. Just that. Protect. My flight left 3 hours late. I sat in the departure lounge with my damp jacket draped over the seat beside me and the slightly wilted yellow chrysanthemums on my lap, and I wrote down everything I could remember, in the notes app on my phone, in the fragmented way you write things when you're trying to catch something before it drifts. Girl in navy coat. Car stopped wrong. Shoulders held tight. Guard steps forward. One step. Red umbrella. Nobody films. Nod. She goes back inside. Touches her collar. That last one I've come back to the most. She touched her collar. It's such a small thing. But I know what it means, that gesture. I've done it myself, in difficult moments. It's the gesture of gathering. Of reminding your body that it knows how to hold itself together even when your mind is less certain. The physical version of, you're still here. You can do this. Keep going. She was 16 or 17, I think, standing on the grounds of a palace that would follow her everywhere for the rest of her life, touching the collar of her coat because someone had been kind and that had made the keeping going feel possible again. I think about that and I think, the kindness of strangers is not a small thing. Not ever. Even when the stranger is standing in a sentry box and the kindness takes the form of a single, quiet, rule-breaking step. Maybe especially then. The train from Edinburgh home was delayed too, as it turned out. Some issue on the line near Dunbar, the kind of thing that adds 45 minutes and an unexplained wait in a dark tunnel outside Waverley. I sat there in the stopped train with my phone battery dying and the chrysanthemums on the seat beside me, probably looking quite eccentric, and I thought about what it means to hold a position. Not in the military sense. In the human sense. We all have positions we're supposed to hold. Roles we've been given or grown into or accepted. The position of parent or employee or professional or child or citizen. The position of the person who keeps it together, the person who follows the rules, the person who doesn't make a scene, the person who waits for the right channel, the right moment, the right permission. And, sometimes, not always, not even often, but sometimes someone we're responsible for needs something that our position cannot deliver. And, we have a choice, we can stay in the box, or we can take one step out of it. One step. Just the one. To make ourselves visible to the person who needs to know that someone is there. Corporal Whitfield went back into his box. He clicked back into position, resumed his blank face, his straight back, his ancient ceremonial stillness. Whatever followed for him professionally, whatever the senior officers made of that 5-minute deviation, whatever notation went into whatever file, I don't know. I hope it was kind. I hope whoever reviewed it understood what I understood, standing there in the drizzle, that the man made a genuinely good call in an impossible situation. That he did, in that moment, exactly what the whole elaborate apparatus of royal protection is ultimately supposed to do. He kept her safe. Not from a threat with a weapon or a crowd turned hostile or any of the dangers those trained men are equipped to handle. He kept her safe from something smaller and harder to name. The particular danger of feeling completely alone in a moment when alone is the thing you can least afford to be. He kept her safe from that. And then, he stepped back into his box, and she went back inside, and the drizzle kept drizzling, and London went on being London, and the world continued turning in its enormous indifferent way. And a stranger on the public side of the railing stood there in wet shoulders with a dying phone and thought, I am very glad I missed that flight. Some things you don't plan to witness. Some afternoons hand you something you didn't know you needed, not a lesson exactly, not a moral, but a reminder. The kind of reminder that doesn't announce itself, that arrives sideways, in the drizzle, through the gate of a palace on a Tuesday, wrapped in something as simple as one person deciding to see another. To actually see them. Princess Charlotte walked back inside. The guard returned to his post. The tourists drifted away. The afternoon closed around the moment like water closing around a stone. But, it happened. And, the thing about moments that happen, real ones, human ones, is that they don't disappear just because nobody filmed them. Sometimes they travel. From an October afternoon at the palace gates, across weeks and months, to a delayed train outside Edinburgh, to a stranger with wilting chrysanthemums and a dying phone, who can't stop thinking about a girl touching her collar and a man making the most important choice of his Tuesday afternoon. One step out of the box. That's all it takes, sometimes. Just one step toward the person who needs to know that someone can see them. That's all it takes.